Hey guys, it's Daniel. Welcome back.
The following is from Keith Richards' biography, Life. Quote, Ian Stewart. I'm still working for him. To me, the Rolling Stones is his band. Without his knowledge and organization, without the leap he made from where he was coming from to take a chance on playing with this bunch of kids, we'd be nowhere. I don't know what the attraction was with Stu and me, but he was absolutely the main impetus behind what happened next. Stu, to me, was a much older man. Actually only by about 3 or 4 years, but at the time when we were starting, it felt much older. And he knew people. I knew nothing. I just come from the sticks. I think he started to enjoy hanging around with us. He just felt there was some energy there. So somehow these other blues players fell away and it ended up being just me, Brian, Mick, Stu, and Dick Taylor on bass. At first that was the skeleton and we were looking for a drummer. We said we'd love that Charlie Watts if we could afford him. Because we all thought Charlie Watts was a God-given drummer, and Stu put the feelers out. And Charlie said, I'd love any gigs I can get, but I need money to hump these drums on the tube. He said, if you can come back to me and say you've got a couple of solid gigs a week, I'm in. Stu was solid, formidable looking, with a huge protruding jaw, though he was a good-looking guy. I'm sure much of his character was influenced by his looks and people's reactions to them from when he was a kid. He was a detached, very dry, down-to-earth, and full of incongruous phrases. Driving at speed, for example, would be going at a vast rate of knots. His natural authority over us never changed. He hated some of the rock and roll stuff that I played. He hated Jerry Lee Lewis for years. Oh, it's all just histrionics. Eventually, he softened on Jerry. He had to crumble and admit that Jerry Lee had one of the best left hands he'd ever heard. Flamboyance and showmanship were not in Stu's bag. You played in clubs. It had nothing to do with showing off. By day, Ian worked in a suit and tie at Imperial Chemical Industries near Victoria Embankment, and this is what helped to fund our rehearsal room fees later on. He put his money where his mouth was, at least where his heart was, because he didn't talk a lot about it. The only fantasy Stu ever had was his insistence that he was the rightful heir to Pittenweem, which is a fishing village across from St. Andrew's Golf Course. He always felt cheated, usurped through some weird Scottish lineage. You can't argue with a guy like that. Why wasn't the piano loud enough? Look, you're talking to the Laird of Pittenweem. In other words, this is not worth discussing, you know? I once said, what's the tartan, then, of the Stewart clan? He said, oh, black and white cheek with various colors. Stu was very dry. He saw the funny side of things, though, and it was Stu who had to pick up all the crap after the mayhem. There were loads of guys that were technically 10 times better, but with his feel on the left hand, they could never get to where he was. He might have been the Laird of Pittenweem, but his left hand came out of the Congo. I don't think the Stones would have actually cogulated without Ian Stewart pulling it together. He was the one that rented the first rehearsal rooms, told people to get there at a certain time. Otherwise, it was so nebulous. We didn't know anything from Shinola. It was his vision, the band, and basically he picked who was going to be in it. Far more than anyone actually realizes, he was the spark and the energy in the organization that actually kept it together in its early days. Because there wasn't much money, but there was this idealistic hope that we can bring the blues to England. We have been chosen. All that dopey sort of stuff. And Stu had such incredible enthusiasm in that way. He stepped out, made a split with the people he played with. He took a leap in the dark there, really. It was against the grain. It alienated him from his cozy little club scene. Without Stu, we'd have been lost. He'd been around the club scene a lot longer. We were just the new kids on the block. One of his first strategies was to wage guerrilla war against the trad jazzers. That was a big, bitter cultural shift. The traditional jazz bands, aka Dixieland bands, semi-beatniks, were doing very, very well. They flooded the market. Very good players, Chris Barber and all those cats. They ran the scene, but they couldn't understand that things were moving and they should incorporate something else into their music. How could we dislodge the Dixieland Mafia? There seemed to be no clinks in their armor. It was Stu's idea that we play the interval at the Marquee Club, a very prominent club in London, while the jazz bands were off. No money in it, but the interval was the thin end of the wedge. Stu figured out that strategy. He would just turn up and say, no money, but interval at the Marquee, or the Manor House. Suddenly, the interval became more interesting than the main event. You put the interval band on, and they're playing Jimmy Reed. 15 minutes. And it was really only a matter of months before the traditional jazz monopoly faded away. There was a bitter hatred of us. I don't like your music. Why don't you play in ballrooms? You go, we're staying. But we had no idea that the ground was shifting at the time. We weren't that arrogant. We were just happy to get a gig.
The following is a clip from my interview with Rolling Stones recording engineer Tapani Tallow. If you want to see the full interview, it's linked below. What was Ian Stewart like? I mean, because I don't think a lot of people understand how important he was to the Stones. Like, what was he like to work with? What was he like as a person?
he was just as devoted as the band, and he knew what needed to be. First of all, you have to say, every time they had a live tour, he would get the best crew to make it happen. And he had that intelligence, and he knew the technicalities behind it, and knew how to control people. There was no fooling around.
Okay.
It was each time it would be technologically cutting edge. And then he could, at the same time, like if I had complaints, he would pick up the phone and find out in the world who's the best person to deal with it.
That's cool. That's cool.
So he would do that for the band, and he would do it for the mobile, and everything was. We only had like 2 people in the office, and Stu and 2 or maybe 3 girls, and it was run incredibly tight with the minimum cost, and there was no need for anything else. And like Stu said, he was so happy because I would never buy any meals that were more expensive than anything else. And because other people came in, they would go berserk because everything was free, and they was just.
That's funny. So I mean, a lot of people aren't aware that Ian Stewart he was one of the original members of the band, if I'm not mistaken. Correct?
He was still official all the way through, except it wasn't mentioned on the albums.
I mean, that's pretty selfless of him that he kind of stepped back to allow the band to go forward like that. Just in terms of his personality, what was he like as a person?
Fantastic. What's the English word? A mate.
Okay, yeah. That's cool. He's a bro, basically.
Yeah. There was just like I would say, like Charlie and Bill and Ian Stewart, they were like the chorus around Mick and Keef.
Oh, interesting way of looking at it. That's cool. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like a real like brothers, and then you have a couple of your brothers are the kind of the stronger part, and then everybody else just pulls the same. Nobody's kicking each other in the wrong way. So he couldn't step between Keith and Mick. No. He would come towards the end of the song, put in the piano and all that stuff, but no, he couldn't come in and say, "Come on, guys, get it right."
Yeah, I hear you.
And so he focused on things like technology because, like, for instance, in the beginning in the studio, the mobile was not acoustically right.
Okay.
The bass sounded way too strong. And when I took material from the mobile into the regular studio, it felt like it was completely dried out. And that's part of It's Only Rock and Roll. You can see at the time it felt very dry compared to the older songs, and that was only because in the mobile it had a full range. And so I said to Ian Stewart, and I said, I can't, if we don't change the acoustics, I'm not going to do any more recordings because you feel like a fool. And we got the world's best guy in, and we fixed it. It was really, Ian Stewart was in that sense fantastic manager. If I said something, it got done.